Right, well, we're going to start with Genesis chapter 5, right, before we get into anything. Genesis chapter 5, verse 1. This is the book of the genealogy of Adam. In the day that God created man, he made him in the image and likeness of God. He created them male and female, blessed them, and called them mankind in the day that they were created. Okay, starting point from a biblical worldview. Man was made in the image of God. He was less than God, but he was like God. He was a reflection of God. He was made in the image of God, an image of God, not in the image of an ape, not in the image of a dumb brute who doesn't know what he's doing, not in the image of an unintelligent caveman who sits around bashing him and his wife on the head with a big bat. That's our sort of cartoon stereotype of cavemen. All right, well, we're going to backpedal a little bit because that's kind of a summary at the beginning of chapter 5 of the origin of mankind. But if we backpedal a little bit to Genesis chapter 4, and we go down to verse 20. It's talking about the sons of Lamech, right? And Adar bought Jabal, and he was the father of those who dwell in tents and have livestock. And his brother's name was Jubal. He was the father of all those who play the harp and flute. And as for Zillah, she also bore Jubal Cain, an instructor of every craftsman in bronze and iron. And the sister of Jubal Cain was Naamah. All right, you see, right back here, just a couple of generations down from Adam, who was, as we read in Genesis chapter 5, made in the image of likeness of God, male and female. You have people who are farming, people who are producing tents, people who are producing musical instruments, and people who are producing stuff in bronze. And of course, if you know anything about bronze and metallurgy, you know that it's a composite metal, it's an alloy made out of copper and tin. And we actually have some bronze here from the so-called Bronze Age. It's actually an old ingot. It's pretty heavy, pretty solid, and it was supposed to be from the time when man first began to work out how to do things with metal. In fact, we have an even nicer, this is one of those lovely Persian era ones, Babylonian and Assyrian kind of era, the Lustrians. This is also made out of bronze. You see the lovely green sheen there. Bronze is pretty good because it doesn't corrode as easily as like other metals like iron does. It does kind of go a little bit tarnished, but this is an original bronze sword from quite a number of years back, from the Bronze Age, supposedly when these people first began to learn how to do things with metal. But only difference is this is from way after the flood. Yet the Bible is emphatic that people were producing bronze stuff a long time before the flood. Okay, where does this come into a biblical worldview? Well, you see, ultimately, because I've got other stone tools here, right? Some pretty nice looking stone tools as well, like this one right here. Hey, can you see all the flakes and how they've chipped and shaved it and made it into this wonderful stone tool? Here's another one, which is actually a hand axe. This is a British example here, actually. You can just see it there. It's designed to actually be held in the hand and used for digging and chiseling away. And then we have this very large reconstruction of one using the Old English U and bound at the top, held in with pitch, and this beautiful axe head on here. And yes, this would chop down a tree. But you see, if you adhere to a secular, orthodox geological or anthropological view, your claim is that the person who made this was more primitive than the person who made this. And the person who made this was more primitive than the person who made this. You see, if you start from a secular worldview where you start, and yes, that's important to understand your presupposition, is that all people evolved from an ape-like ancestor, and given the, according to Orthodox geology, the oldest of these kinds of bones, or so-called claimed bones, come from Africa, you assume that people came from Africa, so you're going to view all stone tools in light of that presupposition. The argument that these kind of tools are the more primitive people compared to the iron tools and the bronze tools that have supposedly come up much, much later. Okay, the problem with all of this, well, we already read it earlier in Genesis chapter 4 and 5. In the beginning, when God created man, he made them in the image of God. Adam was not a dumb brute, he was a genius. He was way more intelligent than me, even way more intelligent than John, because he was made in the perfect original image of God. Of course, if we carry on down through Genesis chapter 5, 5, you find something rather important here, because Genesis chapter 5 verse 3 says, "And Adam lived 130 years and begot a son in his own likeness after his image, and named him Seth." Okay, Seth was not made in the image of God. Seth was made in the image of Adam. I mean, it says it just there. Seth was made in the image and likeness of Adam. Now, at this point in time, Adam was a sinner. Adam was no longer in the perfect image of God. He still bore that image, but it was now a corrupted image. It was a marred image. It was a broken image because of sin. So Seth, being made not in the image of God, but the image of his father, also bore a corrupted, broken version of God's image. Now, all of us here alive today, none of us bear the full true image of God, because we all bear the image of our sinful fathers, who all the way go back to Seth, who goes back to Adam, who was originally made in the image of God, but it's all fallen since then. Case in point, Diane's point is really very accurate and extremely important. The world has gone from good to bad to worse. So what we're really dealing with is not an increase of information or an increase in technology or an increase in intelligence, going from a crude stone tool like this to a slightly more sophisticated stone tool like this, all the way up to a highly sophisticated weapon like this bronze sword, and then onwards and upwards to guns and cannons and so on and so forth. What we're actually dealing with is different types of technology being used at different times for different people who are available to them. I mean, just 3 generations from, or 4 generations from Adam, you end up with people in Genesis chapter 4 producing this before the flood. By the time you get to after the flood, and you get to the man's rebellion and the Tower of Babel, and God scattering 70 different tribes and nations and races across the whole planet, you end up with an isolation of people and an isolation of technology. No longer can everybody produce this kind of stuff. It's pretty sophisticated. You need to know what you're doing, and you also need to have an industry to be able to maintain this. Why? Because if you're going to spend your entire time digging for rocks, you're never going to have enough time to smelt them together into tools. So you need somebody to dig the rocks, and you need somebody to do the smelting, and then you need somebody to be able to actually take that ore like this, the ingots, and actually produce it into a tool like this. And if you've got 3 different people doing 3 different jobs, who's actually giving them food? So you need to have somebody else who's able to go and farm and hunt and produce food for them. In other words, in order to produce something like this, you actually need an entire industry in place. You need an entire city. Now, if you're a wandering nomadic tribe, how much time will you have to do this? Answer, not a lot. But it still takes the same amount of sophistication, but a lot less time and industry to actually pick up the rocks and produce things like this. And these can be just as effective if used in the right way. Oh, and the reality is, we still have people alive today, and increasingly more in the last sort of 150 years or so. If you go back in the last 150 years, there were certainly a lot more tribes and people using tools just like this. You have a look at some of the examples from places like Papua New Guinea, right? They're almost identical to these so-called primitive stone tools. So get out of the mindset that the man who produces this is more primitive or less involved than we are. It's a different technology being used at a different time based on the resources and the knowledge that are available to them. And you'll find that not long after you start producing this, I mean, this is good because it doesn't corrode, but unfortunately it's not quite as hard as iron, so it does bend. So by the time you get to the Philistines, who are learning how to make things out of iron, which leads on to the Greeks and the Romans, you end up with an entire military base around iron and no longer around bronze, simply because it's not as effective as iron. And so it all starts to fall into place. But it's not a case of the older you get, the more primitive it becomes, therefore the stone tools must be older. And so it blows the whole out of Africa argument out of the water.